Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Reduce Clinical Trial Site Burden Through Better Workflows and Fewer Delays. My name is Ryan Muse and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and your comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box. And we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance along the way, you can contact me at any time by sending a message using the same chat panel. I'd also like to welcome our attendees viewing this presentation from our LinkedIn Live event, and I encourage you to submit your questions as well via the comments tab. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming to those who have registered on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Suvoda, who developed the content for this presentation. Suvoda is a global clinical trial technology company with a market-leading real-time software platform that empowers sponsors and CROs to make confident decisions and sites and patients to take calm, controlled action. Suvoda delivers interconnected, action-driven software solutions and industry-leading services and support so that even in the most time-sensitive, mission-critical moments, life-changing studies keep moving forward. Now, I would like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Daniela leads Suvoda's Global eClinical Solutions Consulting team and is based in the Barcelona office. She works closely with clients and prospects, delivering presentations and demonstrations while serving as a subject matter expert on Suvoda's solutions. Daniela joined Suvoda 8 years ago in the services delivery organization, where she worked in project management and gained deep hands-on experience in IRT solution delivery. Andreas has 20 years of experience in ECOA industry and is Vice President of ECOA Solution Strategy at Suvoda. Since 2024, he has led Suvoda's product and commercial strategy for ECOA, driving innovation and industry alignment. Previously, as Vice President of ECOA Practice, he built Suvoda's ECOA service operations, establishing key teams and extending capabilities. And as VP of Customer Success at Suvoda, Kathy is responsible for driving adoption, value realization, and long-term success across Suvoda's global client base. She leads cross-functional teams spanning consulting, training, and customer success, aligning stakeholders and orchestrating execution to ensure clients achieve measurable outcomes and maximize the impact of Suvoda's platform. But now, without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand the mic over to our moderator for today's discussion. Daniela, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kathy and Andres, for joining me here today. And thank you to all of our audience. Welcome to our webinar. We're really excited to be chatting to you today about the site experience, how simpler tech can drive faster and better trials. We're really going to be focusing, as you can see by the title, on reducing clinical trial site burden through better workflows and fewer delays. So let's dive right in. We're all here today because we really care about the site experience, and we can see how central it is to the success of clinical trials. And one of the realities that we've seen a lot, and we'll be discussing today in a lot of depth, is that sites aren't struggling with complexity, they're absorbing it. We know that most trial designs just assume that complexity can be managed centrally, but in reality, we know that it's pushed downstream to sites where it's showing up as things like delay, rework, staff burnout, and a lot of other problems, again, which we'll be touching upon today. So to get us started, I'd like us to take a look at, the landscape as it is now, some of these key pain points that we know that sites experience. So my first question to my panelists today is, let's start talking, like I said, about these site pain points. What are some of the top burdens that we're hearing from sites? And Andres, I'm going to ask you to take it first.
Sure. And first and foremost, thank you everybody for taking the time to meet with us today and engage in this very important discussion. As Danny just mentioned, I think sites have an incredibly tough job. I think that goes without saying. And one of the things that is incredibly important is that, to Danny's point, I think sites absorb a lot of the challenges around the complexities of trials that sponsors are pushing on them. And recently, we've been working with Everest Group as they look to evaluate the IRT landscape. And as part of that work, they surveyed key stakeholders across sites, sponsors, and CROs. And so some of the information that we were able to obtain out of that were some feedback from these different stakeholders, but primarily from sites in particular, in terms of what sites are expecting from sponsors when they're selecting different technologies. And at the end of the day, this is something that you or I would expect from anything, which is just things that work. They want reliable systems. They want systems that make sense together, that are speaking to one another, that intuitively understand where a participant happens to be in a trial, or perhaps systems that anticipate their needs. And so the way that I kind of look at it over the last, 20 years, 21 years in my career, is technology has done a great job of moving things forward, of growing with the ever-changing landscape of technology. But one of those things that has kind of fallen short is that sites have been asked to not just absorb a lot of this complexity, they've been asked to be resilient and adapt to it. And so when we think about the solutions that technology is meant to solve for, one of the big things that keeps coming to mind for me is what are the issues that, while solving for those problems that technology platforms are doing, what are the challenges that technology are actually introducing into that? So are we just simply kicking the can down the road, essentially, just by creating new solutions and then introducing new problems while solving older ones? And part of that is that burden in terms of executing ever increasingly complex studies is then being passed down to the participant. And so, when that happens, it's very, very, very difficult to keep asking participants to be engaged, and then for sites to then have to work across myriad systems, multiple logins, fragmented systems that don't speak to one another. And quite frankly, I think that's some of the top concerns that are expressed today in the field, and why solutions like ourselves, or solution providers like ourselves at Savota, are asked time and time again to continue to find new ways to solve these problems.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Kathy, anything to add from your end?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Andre said, and would just add that another burden that we often hear sites talk about is just the amount of work that's required just for them to help the patient successfully navigate and be able to remain in the trial. So like, patients are balancing work and family obligations, as we all are, but then the clinical trials, they'll introduce some other challenges like transportation or maybe financial considerations. And that's all on top of the realities and stress of living with a medical condition. And the sites themselves, they spend a significant amount of the time that they have trying to support the patients with this. So whether it's answering travel questions or trying to manage schedule changes, that all falls on the sites. We hear that a lot from them. And one thing I find particularly interesting is that much of this work, it isn't formally assigned to anyone, so it's not accounted for. So when questions arise or processes aren't clear, or when a participant needs help navigate the experience, it is the site that often becomes that default coordinator. So they're trying to connect participants to the right resources, or help understand what's the challenge that they're having, how can they help them navigate the process. And that's really like an operational gap that exists across the study experience that the sites are absorbing. And then I would just say, as studies become more complex and patient expectations continue to evolve, that responsibility is only growing. It's not going away. And that's why I think we're seeing so much more interest in solutions that are not only looking to improve the patient's experience, but also provide just clearer support models and better visibility, and just more connected workflows, which I know we're going to talk about a bit more in this, but just more connected workflows so that sites aren't left acting as the coordinator for every issue that arises.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, all of this ties back to what we were saying at the beginning, right? Sites aren't just struggling with this complexity, they're absorbing it. And to Andres' point, we're expecting them to absorb that with a level of resilience that is becoming unsustainable. And personally, I think it's only going to get worse, right? With the rise of technologies like AI, we're going to be able to capture more data and analyze more data, but ultimately it's going to boil down to sites having to execute that and actually be the ones to capture that. So I think this is a really good bridge to the next question that I wanted to ask. So we know that sites are struggling. We know that we're putting a lot of burden on them. I'd like you each to speak to me a little bit about how are we seeing sponsors approach this question of the site experience, and what are sponsors doing to help alleviate some of these burdens from their sites? Kathy, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. I think one of the shifts that we're seeing is that sponsors are really paying more attention to everything that's surrounding participation. So like historically, they tended to focus on solving like an individual challenge, like travel or payments. But what we're seeing now is that the sponsors, which they need to be doing, is taking a broader view and looking at the overall site experience and trying to understand where the burden exists across the study and what they can do to make that participation and study execution easier. So travel is like a good example. The challenge isn't just that they're trying to get a participant to a visit, it's everything that happens around the visit. So it's scheduling transportation, trying to manage the changes. If there's a caregiver, how do they coordinate that? And then all the questions that come when something goes, as it's not going as expected and they need to jump in and figure out what happened. So we're seeing that sponsors recognize that and support the needs, and that's really important. And they're also understanding that the needs can be different from patient to patient. So, being flexible in the solutions that they're providing and investing in, you'll see like from travel, again, like a rideshare solution might be perfectly appropriate for one study, while another study that's rare disease and far more complex might require full concierge support involving how to book flights and hotels. And that expectation today is just increasing flexibility rather than a one-size-fits-all model. And then I'd say another area that's receiving significant attention is site payments. We've heard repeatedly that the issue isn't just as much about whether a payment was made, but that the site just doesn't know where it stands in the process. So sites can spend a lot of time, we hear this a lot of time researching where the payment status is, or trying to answer a question for the patient and trying to track down the information. So what we found is just sometimes simply providing visibility removes a significant amount of the administrative effort. Because ultimately we know sponsors are recognizing that the operational experience matters, and sites know which studies are easy to work on and which ones aren't. And that experience can influence future engagement by the sites.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. So flexibility, visibility, right? Those are the two key things you were sharing, both in terms of like travel, say payments. Andres, anything to add to this list?
So I think everything that Kathy just mentioned are a lot of the known challenges that, either service providers like ourselves, as we engage with sponsors and then subsequently with sites that we learn about. That's why these solutions exist, right? But one thing that I've seen sponsors do is take far more care about engaging sites and participants in terms of getting feedback from site boards or establishing site boards themselves, reaching out to patient advocacy groups, really wanting to get their input into what are the challenges, what's working, what's not working. We ourselves at Savota have undertaken this as well within the last few years. And for me, it's been incredibly eye-opening. In many ways, it's validated some of the things that we as an organization are trying to solve for, because it just means we're getting good feedback, we're being meaningful about that feedback, and then hearing about the impact that it's having. And I think, when I go to conferences, I hear all the time about like, oh, we want the patient's voice or the site's voice in this. You don't necessarily see the fruits of that. Yeah. And so, if you're going to engage in these site boards or in these patient boards, it's so important to not only listen, but to then take action and to demonstrate action. And so, you can want to hear from somebody, but unless you're actually going to do something about it, then like that's how we actually move forward. And I've seen more recently within the last few years, and probably more this year, so many more sponsors being mindful about incorporating site and participant voice in the design of their protocols. And just to think about an oncology protocol that I saw recently, just the flexibility, to Kathy's point, you're talking about logistics and, especially like say it's oncology, but also a rare disease at the same time. You're trying to find participants that may be hours or even a flight away from the site. And how are we designing a study that is going to make it easy for them to receive the care that they need, participate in the study, and help advance science towards potentially helping them or others down the line? And really, when you listen to the feedback from sites, it's about helping them answer those questions that Kathy mentioned. The coordinator's dealing with technology, they're dealing with challenges. And we know we want to help to find solutions that are going to make sense together. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But at the same time, these individuals are dealing with participants with very real questions. How am I getting to the site? I have to take time off work. Is that okay? Can I move my visit? Where is the flexibility in really trying to get the trial to adapt to the participant instead of the other way around? And so I've seen sponsors be far more meaningful and intentional about listening to participants and listening to sites. I think in general, everyone can say that like the industry as a whole can be doing a better job here no matter what, but you got to take those steps first and you got to be intentional about it. And so it's great to see that sponsors are actually doing this, but to kind of tie it together with a bow, it's the same kind of feedback that we're hearing from sites over and over again. So that message is loud and clear for all of us across the industry about what we should be doing.
Yeah, and it's a really good point that you're making about it's great to listen, and yeah, that's an area everyone could do better on, but if you're listening but you're not actioning that, that's not really meaningful, right? So it's really a two-step approach. So I hope our audience is taking that with them, right? Don't just listen, but then actually do something about it. And I think we hear a lot of things. To your point, some of the messages are repeated constantly, and part of our job is making sure the technology keeps up with that, right? So I'm going to steer our conversation into the role of technology a little bit now. I'm going to take that as a nice little bridge, because I'd like to talk about the role and impact of technology on sites in these clinical trials. So we've spoken about complexity in clinical trials, and we know that often technology and different new services are introduced to support these new, more complex trials that are trying to do more and get more out of sites. But one of those messages, to Andres's point, that we keep hearing from sites is that the introduction of these new technologies is also sometimes a burden for them. It adds extra logins, new devices, new trainings, new processes, new challenges. There are all of these additional things that it brings. So my question for my panelists is, how can we make sure that technology becomes an asset rather than just becoming a burden in itself? And Kathy, I'd like to give the floor to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of what you were saying, Danny. I don't think that most sites are resistant to technology as much. I think what they struggle with is when a new solution requires that additional training or processes, or it changes how they work day to day, and it's not clear to them what the payoff of that change is or whether it's worthwhile to them. So I think it's important to focus on how it's being applied in order to ensure it's truly an asset to the site. And one thing we've seen is that sites often develop workarounds that become part of their normal routine. So it might be like a spreadsheet they're maintaining, or a tracking process, or something that they've created because they don't fully trust the system, or doesn't fully meet their needs. And oftentimes, we do get feedback from sites, but they don't always mention these things because it's become so ingrained in how they work. So to me, like, purpose-built technology is really about understanding where the coordinators are spending their time, and where these delays occur, or where errors tend to happen, and where are the workarounds that they're doing today, and then designing those solutions that eliminate that effort rather than just simply like shifting it to somewhere else where it needs to be handled. And one thing I hear consistently from sites is that they don't need vendors to simply hand them another system, which is what we're talking about. But what they really want, and they say this, is we need partners who understand the operational realities that they're dealing with and can help them successfully incorporate that technology into their day-to-day workflows. I come to appreciate that successful technology adoption, which we've been working on for years now, it's less about the technology itself, and it really is about what, everything that's surrounding it, how it's implemented, how the sites are trained, how quickly change is managed, or how quickly issues are addressed. Those things often determine whether a solution is viewed as helpful or burdensome, whether the sites are going to consider it, truly to be an asset. And implementation is important, but adoption is where the value is realized. So organizations that do focus on this, as much, focus on enablement and the change management as much as the technology itself, are the ones that are going to be successful. Because at the end of the day, sites aren't evaluating technology based on how sophisticated it is. They're evaluating it based on whether it saves them time and reduces their effort, and then ultimately helps them to focus more on the patients.
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, sites are people, right? And as people, we all know change is hard. We don't like to change. We don't like to learn new things. It's putting us outside of our comfort zone. So I like the emphasis you put on being partners with them, right? I think it ties back well to what Andres was saying before about listening to them and gaining their feedback. So Andres, anything that you want to add on that front?
Something Kathy mentioned right as she was answering that question reminded me of an anecdote that a sponsor shared at a recent conference. And granted, while this talk was AI focused, the sponsor mentioned visiting a site, and it was either for a site feasibility visit or something along those lines. And the thing that actually stood out to them wasn't, how organized the site was or anything, but rather that the lead coordinator there showed up and had this like spiral bound notebook under her arm, and like walked around with it like it was her child, and like would not let go of it. And when the sponsor asked this person what this notebook was, it was all of the little cheat sheets, logins. It was tracking participant. This was how this coordinator did their job. And that was just at this one site. And so when you think about how different sites operate, because you have site networks, you have academic centers, you have small individual sites, you have larger sites. They all have different institutional processes, different policies that they have to adapt to, and things like that, which means technology can't be a one size fits all. And you see that a lot in solutions, but you also see how intentional certain service providers have been about creating a non-generalized solution. Yet, to me, it still feels like all of these solutions are putting sites on rails and forcing them to carry a notebook that gives them their cheat sheet around that one study. Think about all the studies that they're running. Think about all the participants that they're having to see. And so, in this day and age, in 2026, someone's walking around with like a handwritten guide, essentially, to like how to do their job every day. The technology should be more intentional about solving those challenges. How do we take that notebook out of the coordinator's hand and have them trust that the system is going to guide them and tell them what they need to do instead of asking them to jump through hoops? So from that perspective, simplicity or simplification instead of overly burdening a site because the solution is new and funky and it's going to do these cool new things, but how is it tying into everything else? And so instead of thinking about how systems integrate with one another, we should be talking about how systems unify and create a singular experience. And that could mean competitors working with each other, about partnering and trying to find solutions that make sense for the sites. At the end of the day, those are our customers. Like, we are trying to get trials executed cheaper, faster, better, getting drugs approved. That's the mission, right? So we should be intentional about looking at ways in which we build and develop solutions that are attacking these paradigms, or at least following them, rather. And so when you think about solving a problem, I think Kathy mentioned this, certain vendors can go out there and try to solve this like one big thing, right? But inherently, they're not necessarily thinking about how that ties into an ecosystem, or not following what we like to call user-centered design, which is thinking about all of the different individuals, all the different users, participants, site, site manager, PI, CRA, how everyone is engaging in that system, and how that one solution ties in to the different things that each user has to do. You have to be intentional about solving the problem for the community as opposed to just the individual. And sometimes it's kind of like you don't see the forest for the trees. You're like, this one thing is solving this one problem, which was super burdensome on this last phase 3 that we had. And a sponsor engaged a vendor like Savota, like, oh, we'll invest with you and we'll try to build this one thing. But are you just creating this like silver bullet that's trying to solve a small problem, when in reality it's just creating a burden for tons of other sites that may not be aligned with that solution? So I preach, and I think at Savota we do this, whenever we have a problem, that we think about how we solve it in the simplest way, and how we try to bring sort of our own expertise along with the way that, like, what the technology can do, which ultimately is coming back to a point that I made earlier about adaptation. We shouldn't just be asking the sites to adapt. This should be something technology should be adapting to sites, or sponsors even, but mostly to sites. How is the solution flexible so that it is not a general solution? It's not a one size fits all. It's one that it's adaptable to the different scenarios and lived experiences that sites have.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that can be gained, again, just tying it back to what we said before, through this feedback that we might be able to get from them, right? Listening, communicating, partnering, as Kathy said. So I think we're kind of seeing how it's all tying together here really nicely. But I actually have a follow-up question for you, Andres. You were talking about, maybe implementing a solution that might be applicable to one site, but maybe not another. So I'd like you to speak to us a little bit more about, you might be running a global study. You might have sites all around the place with lots of different operating procedures, different ways of doing it. So I'd love to hear more about what it takes to successfully build and roll out new technology across really diverse global sites.
I think it starts again with being adaptable. So when you think about a one-size-fits-all solution, like I just mentioned, we're thinking about different kinds of sites. And then really the outer layer of that is different countries, different agencies and how they operate, the regulatory environment in different places, the expectations. And we as an industry have generally been slow to continue to evolve and grow with not just technology, but to the growing changes culturally that we have in the world. Like COVID was a watershed moment. Like we began to figure out how we could get to participants where they are at and how to be more accessible to participants. You had the notion that we needed to engage participants more broadly and address underserved populations and things of that sort. But when we think about that from a global standpoint, your solution has to be able to adapt to fit the needs of sometimes an individual country within the scope of the entire trial. eConsent's a great sort of example here because of how differently different countries approach from a privacy standpoint and from a consenting and like the rights of the participant and things like that. Even in the United States, we have individual states that have different perspectives here. Your system shouldn't just be putting that solution where only a fraction of sites are able to use it. And if you don't do this intentionally, then you're missing the point, if you ask me. So you need to be prepared to have your solution scale. One thing we get asked by sponsors all the time is, can you roll out a protocol amendment gradually? So as different countries or different sites are approved for that amendment, can you do it? Or is it you have to wait until everybody is approved to roll that out? And I can't believe that we're still having that conversation in 2026. Like that should be a hard requirement for any system these days, is that know that this is a reality. It's been a reality in clinical research for a very long time. So again, it goes back to simplicity. You have to think about these things and about everyone that's involved and engaged. And again, not force either a sponsor or a site or a CRO in this case to have to adapt to how they're running the trial because the solution requires you to do it that way. It has to be the other way around. So I think when you talk about being ready for that, it's making sure that you have systems in place that are able to remove guardrails, that are able to take, the curveballs that we will get from time to time with different sponsors or different CROs to be able to adapt. And yeah, not every solution or not every is going to be the right fit, and you're going to run into some roadblocks here and there. But the more intentionally that you do that, the better you serve that study. Again, it's not going to be a solution that solves every single problem, but if you approach it intentionally that way, you'll solve most of them, which is the expectation, I think, that sites now have of technology. I think they're surprised when they're like, why, it can't do this? Like that's ridiculous. Like,
yeah. Especially as we all live in a world that is increasingly, governed by technology, right? It's in everyone's day-to-day life, so our expectations are shifting. But I really like the protocol amendment rollout example you gave. I think it's such a good example of not only flexibility, but also, to your point, of different sites might be at different points, in the same trial, and we need to be able to have technology that can adapt to that. So, yeah, thanks for sharing that example. Kathy, I wanted to see if you had anything you wanted to add to the global site aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Andreas said. I think he nailed it with his answer there. But I think, beyond just the technology, sometimes the harder challenge is understanding how the sites actually work in different parts of the world and recognizing that there just isn't that single global site experience. And the realities of a larger academic, medical center can be very different from those of a smaller research site, whether it's the level of staffing that they have or how advanced and comfortable they are with technology. The way patients engage with research can be different. And even, as Andreas had said, even expectations around the technology can be very different. And that goes beyond the technology. It goes for the training and support, because that can vary significantly across regions as well, we've learned. And that's why I think it's just important to look beyond, again, just the technology and understanding what's the supporting processes or what are the workflows, that the sites are using across the globe. I mentioned earlier, it's not enough to just simply build the technology. You got to understand how they're operating and design not just the technology, but the surrounding processes and the support model, to meet those needs. So looking at how the training is delivered, how is support provided, what is their preference, what documentation is needed. We've seen situations where one region strongly prefers short video-based learning, while another wants detailed written documentation. And in my mind, I'm thinking nobody wants this full, written documentation anymore. They want something that's fast and quick that they can get to. But the more that you explore and you talk to different regions and different sites, you might find that you were wrong. And there are some that want just that. So you have to be able to provide whatever's needed and be flexible enough to support them so that they're, again, able to get the true benefits and adopt the system, right? So it's just understanding how people learn and how they work and what support they need, that I'd say. But the technology matters, but the surrounding experience, again, just often determines whether the adoption is going to succeed.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for sharing your thoughts on that point. I think we've done a great job so far of talking about, the site experience, how sponsors are helping tackle that, the role of technology in this. So what I'd like to do now is I'm going to move us into talking about some real life scenarios so that we can highlight some examples of these workflow unifications. I think it would be a great way for our audience to see some of this, in action, because we've talked a lot about these challenges, like I've said, but I really want us to discuss the specifics and the nitty gritty. So I'm going to bring up a scenario and we'll be discussing it. So the first scenario that I'd like to talk about is eCOA and patient payments. These tools sometimes work alongside each other, but not necessarily together. So I'd like to discuss how can these actually work together to help ease the site burden that we've been talking about, but I guess also the patient experience, because both of these are patient-facing solutions that the patients themselves will have to engage with. So yeah, just wondering how this workflow can be connected to result in a better experience for everyone. So Andres, I'm going to ask you to talk about it first, and then we'll hand it over to Kathy. I'm sure she'll have some thoughts to add too.
So with my background in eCOA, obviously the last 20 years has been very focused on do your diary, how do you get patients to be compliant, like how do you create a system that makes sense. When Savota and Greenfire merged, I had the opportunity to learn a lot more about patient payments. And I think the central theme there was about engagement and about how you make participants be more engaged in a study. For a very long time, I had considered patient compliance really tied into routine and habit, which is, I still firmly believe. I completely missed the point of compensation and the routine and what happens to participants. And we partnered with SysScript towards the end of last year. They did a survey in 2025 around patient engagement, and there was so much feedback around payments in particular. And as not the expert in the room on payments, the one tie-in that I had there was really around how payments drive compliance in eCOA. So Kathy, I'm actually curious more about what you've heard in your experience coming from the Greenfire side.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that stood out for me when you talk about like SysScript discussion around like micropayments was that participants weren't really talking about the payment amount, but what I found so interesting is they were talking about the experience, and what they appreciated was the immediacy and the transparency of the payments, and truthfully the recognition that their effort had been acknowledged, which I found so interesting. We focus so much on making sure that the payment occurs and that it happens timely, but what we're finding is that through the integration of eCOA and patient payments, when they're connected, what we're doing is we're creating a much more predictable experience, and that is something that is really appreciated. The immediacy and the transparency of the payments is so valuable. Patients complete an activity and then they can clearly see what happens next. They don't have to wonder whether something was received or wonder whether they're eligible for a payment. I think that's incredibly valuable. And then sites don't have to sit in the middle of those routine interactions because it's all there, it's all visible. So to me, the opportunity isn't just simply about automating the payments. It's also about eliminating that uncertainty, creating that predictability and follow up, and the administrative effort that often surrounds those payments being eliminated by this.
When we talked about unifying systems. And as our legacy systems have been combined now into a single app experience for participants, I think the thing that's the coolest that I've seen, and you mentioned about this, but it was more in the context of site payments and like knowing where their payments are and having more visibility into the process. All of you just mentioned having that same transparency for the participant is just so valuable. And part of that is not just, oh, am I getting paid? Am I getting reimbursed on this trip? Or, you know, I completed something, my compliance is high and I'm getting a micro payment as a result. I also think that it aligns very much with the everyday expectation that people have of technology today. And so, you know, you're not, I remember someone from our product team was like, oh, we're about to roll this thing out. You know, we have to sit there for 15 seconds for the thing to load. It was like 15 seconds. After 2 seconds, I'm putting my phone down. Like the thing isn't working. Like that's like our expectations have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. So think about it from a patient's perspective, and are they getting paid? And especially think about, you know, now that we're trying to reach more underserved populations or folks that have multiple jobs and they're going to have to take time off work and maybe not get paid. And that reimbursement is the reason they stay in the study, for example. To have the visibility within the same app experience as what is pinging them to then complete their daily diary, for example, is what if you ask me today, what people expect, like everything is in the same thing. If I'm asked, and I'll use a weird out of industry example, like I tried to do a claim for my pet insurance the other day, and it kept opening up another app, and I was like, what is going on? Like this shouldn't work this way. Why isn't this not like know what it is that I'm trying to do? And so that gave me pause because it made me think about our own app and all of the different things that we're doing. And yes, connecting these two things, connecting payments with the eClinical elements of completing diaries or being in a routine are really the right solutions that make sense together. And so, you know, it is kind of going back to some of the points that we made earlier about listening to what is burdening participants, what their expectations are, and having solutions that just make sense. And I know that sounds a little sort of like wishy-washy to a certain extent. It's like we should all be saying that, but it's how you follow through on that. And that's like the SysScript survey said it. You know, when we go to patient advocacy groups, they're saying that participants need to be respected as human beings. Their questions are meaningful. It doesn't matter what they are. And the app, if it's answering those questions, then you're taking burden off the coordinator. They're not having to call the coordinator to be like, where's my reimbursement? Am I getting paid for this? You know, the system should just be taking care of it.
Yeah, I think you make great points. I completely agree with everything you said. You know, the expectation has moved in the direction of immediacy, right? That is something that we expect in all aspects of technology, but also transparency, I think, is a big one, right? We know that the data is stored online. So sometimes it's like, why can't I access it? Why aren't you showing me that this is happening, that it's being processed, that it's going through, right? It should be so simple if the data is there. The excuse of, oh, well, it's filed in a, you know, it's filed in someone's cabinet in an office somewhere. That's not the case anymore. So we should be able to provide this information to patients. And I actually also liked what you were saying at the end about, you know, again, we're talking about the site experience here, but giving patients a better experience ultimately gives sites a better experience because they're the ones that the patient is going to call if they have an issue. They're the ones that the patient is going to go to. But this is also removing work from them. You know, I know we've kind of moved away from the eCOA micropayments piece to talk a little bit more about patient payments in general. But if a patient can submit a payment request, a reimbursement request through an app, that means they're not going to show up at a site with a receipt and tell the site to do it, right? So it makes it easier for the site as well. They receive it online, they're able to process it. So yeah, I really think that we're looking at better experiences all around.
I think so too. And just to add to that, I think creating predictability and visibility, it's giving trust to the sites and the patients, right? And I think that's such an important piece of it, you know, where we're hearing that more and more.
That's a really good point. It's not just about the expectation, it's about making sure that we're building that trust, keeping them engaged, as we said, right? To make sure that they want to actually continue in our trial and you know, help us gain the data that we need ultimately.
Yeah.
Perfect. That was a really interesting discussion. So I'm going to bring us to another scenario, if that's okay with both of you. We've spoken about, like I said, eCOA, patient payments, the micropayments, and what we can gain by linking those two together. I have another scenario that, Andres, I think it's probably going to be a little bit better suited for you, but Kathy, if you want to chime in, please do. I want to talk about having ECOA and IRT together.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to hear from you how, again, having these solutions work together help optimize the patient experience, site experience throughout that like screening, randomization, drug dispensation workflow. And, if there are any risks as well by tying these two together and connecting these different systems.
It's kind of similar to what I said earlier when, now that Savota and Greenfire are one company, and how I didn't know a lot about patient payments and the impacts and things like that. When I joined Savota, I knew very little about IRT and drug supply, and I knew that it was very complex and very nuanced, but it was always this other system, right? And, kind of like I had my blinders on around what a site visit was, and kind of take into consideration, what a coordinator goes through when they're needing to enroll a participant, assign them a diary, and then they have to send a participant on their way to complete their diaries or, complete questionnaires there in clinic. And as I began to learn more about the platform, one of the things that became evident to me not only was the strength that Savota had in terms of creating a system that guided the site. So instead of prompting the site to say like, what visit are you at? And, asking the site, to understand what activities or what tasks are required for that visit, for the system to intuitively present that to the coordinator. And that just makes perfect sense for slotting in at that point, because you're just like, wait a second, they're in one place and they click on one button and it does these things for them. Like in my mind, the workflow that made sense was you go here, you do this, you create your participant, you get your ID. Okay, now I can go into my ECOA system and create that. I have the ID now, right? And that was the way of the world.
Yeah.
So when I started seeing the strength of combining the creation of the participant and then how that fed into the clinical workflow for them so that it prompted the completion of ECOA or all the different ECOA tasks, all of a sudden that clicked for me. And, our founder and CEO, Jagath Wananayaka, preaches this all the time about time-sensitive, mission-critical moments in the trial. So that's been burned in my mind, because when you think about the solutions that make sense together, it's that unification of the things that just make sense. The system needs to do what it needs to do for that visit. And I, as a coordinator, shouldn't have to be telling the system like what I'm there for or what I'm doing. It should be telling me. And the more it does that, the better the downstream impacts are. And we've noticed this now over the last few years, just how important that element is from all of the things that happen in a trial behind the scenes, everything related to data and reporting, access to information, the different individuals that are looking at how a site is empowered to conduct a visit. If I have to go and randomize a participant today, and they're supposed to have been doing diaries for the last 3 weeks, I shouldn't need to go to another system to find that out first before I go and I randomize them. The system should know exactly where that participant is. And if, as they arrive, they're not going to be compliant, I should be notified of that so that I can then follow up with that participant, so that when I do randomize them, it's taking all of that information into consideration with the single click of a button. And we talked about, in the patient payments or micropayments scenario just now, if a participant is being compliant, it can trigger a micropayment. And then they see that directly within the app. Coordinator's done nothing at that point. If you push that down to that randomization visit, the coordinator is just clicking randomize because that's what they're supposed to do. And then the system says their participant has completed 7 out of the last 10 diaries. They are compliant from an ECOA perspective. Here is their lot number. Here are the drug units that you need to assign. They just did one click after they've obviously signed in and done a bunch of other stuff. But one click for randomization. And now they're moving on. Think about all the time that they now have to address the questions that every participant is going to have, instead of spending 10, 15, maybe 30 minutes just getting through the motions of signing into one system, doing a few things, going into another system, doing more. What if they make a mistake? Now they have to call the help desk. We all know these scenarios. We're all very familiar with them.
Yep.
What excites me the most about what we're doing, and why I'm so bullish about what we're doing, is because of the fact that the system intentionally tries to remove that burden from the site. You don't see that. I mean, other systems are obviously catching up, and everyone is thinking about this and trying to make things simpler and easier. But it's one of those, it's almost like a no-brainer moment, right? Like it should do that. Like that makes sense. Like this action then leads into the next one. The system should just intuitively know to do that and guide the user, in this case, the coordinator, to helping the participant move through the study and just know exactly what it is that they need to do next. So the connection between IRT and ECOA at that point made so much sense to me. And when you have a system that is truly unified, not integrated, not multiple solutions that have been individually built and then bolted together, but rather one that has been architected from the ground up to inherently, work as a single solution. It's impressive because it really does begin to solve those problems. It's not perfect, but it does begin to solve those problems.
Yeah, and I'm hearing a lot of the themes we had in the previous scenario, right? The flexibility, the immediacy, the transparency, all of that is kind of reflected. We were talking a bit more from the patient's perspective before, but it's the same at the sites, right? It's all ultimately going to help build that trust. And again, we're looking at the site experience. That's what we're trying to improve. If we give them technology that's able to help build that trust, I think it's going to be successful for everyone and a win-win for all parties involved. So
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing on this. Kathy, I do have a scenario for you. Don't worry. I know that Andres is more in the ECOA world, but I did want to ask you about travel. So you have a little bit more experience on the patient travel side of things, how patients often need support, getting to their visits and being able to, just manage all of the logistics surrounding it. So I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit about how that could fit into a broader platform, how that workflow can help, again, that site experience that we're talking about today.
Sure. Yeah, I think travel is one of the clearest examples of why the connected experience really matters in clinical trials. And what I like about this approach of combining them is that, travel can become part of the patient journey from the very beginning rather than something that's managed separately. So at study startup, when the participant profiles are being established and the assessments and payment requirements are being configured within the system, travel needs can also be incorporated into that same experience. And that means sites don't have to figure out where to go when a patient needs support. The information's already there, connected to the broader study workflow, and that makes it far more convenient for them. And the other thing that I've learned is that travel needs vary significantly from patient to patient. We talked a little bit about this. From study to study, therapeutic area can change, but the key is that the support model can scale based on the needs of the patient in the study. So for some studies, the patient may simply need transportation, where others it's much more complex, right? Like we said before, ride share versus having to do the logistics of having a caregiver and even documentation support needed, or special accommodations or coordination, across multiple visits. It just becomes far more complicated. But for straightforward needs, sites or patients can request transportation directly through the technology. And then for the more complex scenarios, we've got a travel team that can take over the coordination and manage that entire experience. So including booking the flights, the hotels, the ground transportation, if there's a caregiver, making those arrangements, and then any other travel logistics that might go along with that. And what's important is that everybody has visibility into what's happening. I know this is a theme I keep saying, but we hear this so often, is there's so much additional burden that comes from just not knowing what is happening. Things may be taken care of, but if that's not visible, questions come into the site through the patients. Is much more concerns that are raised, and it just takes more time away from the more high impact things that the sites can be doing. So the patient can see their travel details, the site has visibility into the arrangements, and the study team, they don't have to rely on emails or spreadsheets or a separate system to understand what's happening. It's all right there for them. To me, that's really where the value comes in. It's not just the travel support, it's all of that. It's having it all, working together as part of a connected experience rather than, a collection of separate processes that they're managing.
Yeah, and I like we're touching upon visibility yet again. I know that we've repeated some of the same themes a lot, but I think these are the important ones, right? These are the ones that we want our audience members to remember and take away from today. And to your point, if there's not that visibility, it creates uncertainty. And that's going to do the opposite of what we've been trying to get to today, which is talk about how we can build that trust up, right? So if we really want to make sure that we have that trust, a lot of what you're talking about is going to be absolutely critical. So yeah, thank you for sharing. Okay, so now that we've covered our different scenarios, I'm gonna, kind of summarize a little bit and ask you a final question before I hand it over to Ryan to see if we have any audience questions. So we've spoken about a lot of different things today. We know that sites are under pressure from a lot of this complexity, the fragmentation that we're talking about. Technology is helping in many ways, but we've got to be very thoughtful and mindful about how we can make sure that this technology is reducing and not adding to sites' burden. One way that we've spoken about doing this is unification, not just integration, really making sure that the technology is working together and working with sites in a way that sites wants to work, in a way that we hear and respect feedback that we're gaining from the sites. And we've also spoken about some example scenarios, IRT, ECOA, patient payments, travel, all of these different elements, even the patient-facing app, how all of these working together and unified can help reduce that effort for the sites, while offering, what we said, visibility, transparency, immediacy, which ultimately is all going to work together to build that trust. So last question, I'm looking for a very quick answer, very, very brief, one sentence from each of you. What aspirations or predictions do you have for Site Realities in, let's say, 3 to 5 years' time? Where do you think the industry is going and what do you think it's going to look like? And I don't mind who goes first. Does anyone have a preference?
No.
Kathy, do you want to take it?
Oh, sure. I think the thing that I'm hoping to see is that over the next few years is that the sites just spend less time managing the logistics. I know we talked a lot about that, but there's such an opportunity for them to be focused on the activities that they need to be able to be doing and supporting the patients, delivering the care. I mean, that's why we're doing all of this, right? So making sure that they're able to actually do the high value activities that they should be doing. And I don't think the future will be defined just by more technology. I think it's going to be defined by technology that's becoming less visible, so that they don't have to see all these different technologies, that things do flow through the systems, and that they don't have to log into as many systems. That connectivity, I think, is just incredibly important. And I think everybody is starting to tune into that and to see that. And Andreas mentioned before, whether that is a technology that we can offer ourselves as Savota, or whether we need to work with other companies, people are starting to realize that that's a reality and that we should be working together, because behind this is the patient experience. We want to make sure that we are doing right by them and the site, so that they can be focused on that patient experience. So for me, it really is that it's connecting the systems and working together to ensure that we aren't creating more burden, but we truly are eliminating it.
I like that. If you'll allow me to paraphrase a little bit, not more technology, but better technology, right? That's kind of what we're talking about here. Yeah. Perfect. Andres, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I see kind of a change in how sites engage with technology. Obviously, we're in the age of agentic AI and things like that. I think the most exciting thing about that for me is, if you're in a system and let's say you have 10 participants that you're seeing that day, and you really quickly need to have the system do something, or you have a question, to just be able to engage conversationally with the system, to be able to say like, hey, a participant so-and-so is here, I don't know what to do. And then the system just tells you. Like, that alone is just so valuable. I mean, we alluded to this, Kathy, you mentioned before, like, sites don't want to be leafing through a tome of 200 pages to figure out like what button to click, or what do I do next. And I do this a lot with Claude and other things, where it's just like, I have this problem and I just want to talk to somebody about it. And like, I think the more we embrace that, and again, we are here at Savota, but like, I think we're going to start seeing this more and more and more and more. First it was chatbots, now it's actually like, AI agents that are helping to guide us, that have informed, like, or they have access to the information. They're like, do you want me to handle that for you? I'm like, yes, please. While I go and I talk to my participant, because their Uber is late, or like they asked if they could get a snack, and like, I can go take care of that and make the experience that much better for them, while the system is handling the things that it needs to. I think we're going to see way more of that. To Kathy's point, it's better tech, not more tech. It's how the tech is actually improving things, as opposed to what else is it solving for. Because some of these problems, again, are the ones that technology has inherently introduced. So what are we doing to like, solve for those problems or actually change the way that those problems are solved? Again,
Yeah.
I think not to be focused on agentic, but like that's that I see that happening.
It's such a reality, right? Like I think we have to talk about it a little bit, but I completely agree with what you're saying, and just we've got to be conscious of it is changing. The processes that the sites are doing are changing too, and that's been a message throughout this. But it's like staying close to the sites and what their workflows are, and how the agentic AI is going to change that, and making sure that we're aware of that and how our technology and our surrounding processes need to remain flexible and in lockstep with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Ultimately, we're all trying to, eliminate the example Andres was saying before, right? Someone at a site with a paper notebook that if they lose, their entire life will crumble, right? We're trying to provide them better tools to be able to tackle that. Well, listen, Kathy, Andres, thank you so much both for your insights. This has been hugely educational for me, and I'm sure for all of our audience members too. So I really, really appreciate it. I'd like to use the leftover time to open it up to questions. I'm going to ask Ryan back and see if there are any audience questions for us, and we'll be happy to take them. So thank you again to everyone.
Thank you very much for this very insightful discussion that you've had today. As we move into the Q&A portion of the webinar, though, I would like to direct the audience's attention towards the handouts module, where you'll find some additional documentation related to today's presentation to download for some further reading. Also, please keep sending in your questions or comments right now for the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you're attending via GoToWebinar, you can use the questions window, and for those watching on LinkedIn Live events, feel free to post your questions in the comments section. Now, I have already received some questions from the audience, so we'll get ourselves started with those. The very first question I have here states that they're wondering generally, are you seeing that sites are open to utilizing technology for patient engagement?
Yeah, I would say that they are. I think, it's a misconception that sites are technophobes or adverse to tech. They actually want solutions that make sense and that are reliable, like as we mentioned before, but there is a huge appetite for them to do more to engage with their participants. I think, ultimately sites care the most about them and making sure that we as solution providers are not creating more problems for them in terms of how they want to engage with their participants.
Very good, thank you. Next up, someone says that you talked about flexible deployment. They're curious, what are some examples of configuring deployment across different study needs?
Trying to do that. I think the key is just recognizing that flexibility isn't just about giving every study more options. It's just aligning the level of support, technology, and operational processes to what the study actually requires. And one of the challenges our industry has faced historically is that we often try to apply the same approach to very different studies. And I said this before, but a rare disease study is a very different need than a large phase 3 trial. An oncology study may require a very different participant support model than a study where most activities occur from home. So I think, we've been talking about flexible deployment and just how important it is, but designing around those realities becomes so important. And again, just, from a travel perspective, we talked about this a lot, but like thinking about the different needs of, the patients that are going to be travel, and the human, element behind what they're going through is so important. Myself, I get nervous when I'm trying to coordinate all of my travel plans, let alone somebody that might be a mother of a very sick child that's going to another country, and what are their needs? Do they, need to have a companion with them, and what are the needs of the actual patient? So I think being able to have flexible deployment models, like, a concierge model where you have people that are really trained on understanding the complexities of the trial, but are also trained on being able to work and be empathetic for the patient that is traveling. And, those types of things are just, it's so incredibly important when you talk about, deploying and being flexible in your deployment.
Yep, very good. Thank you very much. Another question here from someone, I think it's pretty common, is they're curious about travel costs, how they're handled. Are patients reimbursed, or are they covered?
Yeah, I'll take that one too, if that's okay, Andres. In most cases, travel costs are covered up front rather than reimbursed after the fact. The travel is funded by the sponsor and managed through the travel program, so patients aren't expected to pay out of pocket and wait to be reimbursed, later. And I think that's a really important distinction, because reimbursement, assumes a patient has the ability to even absorb that cost up front. And we know the reality is, for some patients, particularly those traveling long distance, requiring flights, that can become a barrier to participation. So the goal is to remove that barrier before it even becomes an issue and cover that up front so that patients can focus on their health and not have to worry about that sort of thing. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that answer and for all of the answers, but we have reached the end of our time today. For those interested in hearing more from Suvoto, you can register for their next webinar discussing the Everest study findings, which is scheduled for September 22nd by visiting and registering on xtalks.com. Know that if we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Suvoto will follow up with you, or if you have some further questions, you can direct them to the email address that's up on the screen. I want to thank everyone again for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen if you click the exit button, and your participation is appreciated as it helps us to improve our webinars. Additionally, I've shared a link to view the recording of today's event in the chat box, which you can also share with your colleagues so they may register for the recording here as well. For those watching via LinkedIn Live events, we encourage you to visit xtalks.com so that you can register for this event and gain access to features such as viewing that recording and more. Now, please join me once more in thanking our speakers for their wonderful time here today. We hope that you found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.